Mine is not, mine is not, my tests are not like that. Okay. But you do have to spend, in my opinion, my diagnosis here is that people have to spend a little bit more time with the text. The mean for the lecture items was awesome. It was like 73 or 74. I analyzed that separately all the time. And what that means is that if you show up and you're, marginally conscious during the lectures, and we've got a lot of really bright lights in this class. I can tell from the contributions in the chat and from what people are writing me. We've got a lot of engaged students. The lecture items were answered very well. And it was okay when you look at the distribution of the responses. It was a quote unquote psychometrically correct test. Okay, so everybody can learn from that. The people who got A's and A pluses, I urge you not to bail on midterm test two. Okay, as sometimes attractive, an attractive prospect, because you can always still do better. Okay, maximize your chances of doing well in the overall grade. Okay, so let's move along here. Wow, it's 7:20 already. Going to switch gears now in the second third of the course. In the first four lectures, we looked at personality theories that were born in the clinical settings, okay, that were born in clinical contexts, where theorists listened to people, usually patients, yeah, share their personal experiences, and then they made inferences about general personality structures, general personality processes. Okay, that's what Freud did. And as rich and as maybe interesting and maybe even compelling as those theories are, you read in the textbook that dominant criticisms in the literature center on their lack of, first of all, their lack of verifiability. Really hard to generate a measurement technique to assess something like the Oedipal conflict. Yeah. So a lot of the concepts don't lend themselves to empirical verification. Remember, Freud only had what 38 patients all together, and the criticisms center on their lack of generalizability. He saw 38 patients. They were all from a certain place and a certain social class in Vienna at a certain time. Um, uh, Challenging to make generalizations about what is true of all people. And another dominant criticism of those theories is that they lacked what we could call quantitative rigor. Okay? No measurement. Really interesting, rich theoretical ideas, but very few of them were difficult to measure in the traditional sense. And as a consequence of precisely those disappointments, there was a shift. There was a huge shift in emphasis towards an emphasis in measurement. Personality psychology shifted post Freud and the neo Freudians and adopted what we would call a psychometric approach. Okay, psychometrics is the study of psychological measurements. Why do I not have my thing here? Okay, let me find that question there again. All right, so I just gave, for those of you who came in late, I asked the students to take a look at this, the adjective checklist, okay, and fill it out, indicate which of these 54 adjectives just they think describe them. So I want you to imagine that you've signed up for, I'm guessing everybody has done this, to participate in the URPP. Yeah, that's where they give you extra bonus points and intro psych for participating in somebody's research, usually graduate students' research, yeah. And they take you to one of those tiny little offices in the basement of the BSB. And the graduate student says to you, "Thanks for signing up. I want you to sit at this desk, and inside this folder are a whole bunch of questionnaires that I want you to fill out." Okay. What do they give you when you sign up for that these days? The URPP. What do you get? Do you get bonus points on your grade, correct? Nobody did that?
For my psychology course, it was worth like 4% of our grade. So if we didn't participate, it would like 4% would be deducted.
Right. Okay. We can talk about the validity of that another time. Okay, so let's imagine that the ACL, this thing here on the screen now, is on top of the pile. When we participate as subjects or participants in a research study, as humans, we're driven to impose meaning. Yeah. And you look at this questionnaire here, really simple. Okay, it's one page. You very likely were trying to figure out what was being measured on this questionnaire. So if I asked you now, those of you who did it, what do you think it measures? What are your thoughts? What do you think the adjective checklist measures? Qualities that you appreciate about yourself. Okay, what do you mean by appreciate, Casey Joe?
I think maybe, well, I think you could look at this list and a lot can happen for somebody, but perhaps somebody would look at this list and maybe pick items that they like about themselves. So, for
Oh,
example, we all could be any, you know, level of these different words and
right.
adjectives, but perhaps someone could go, am I cynical? No, you know what? I'm really jolly. And maybe they just pick out, they're cherry picking the ones they like. I don't know. I just
Okay.
toss it out there. That's my guess.
Well, that there are a lot of hypotheses in what Casey Joe just put on the table here, and we'll look at them one by one. I'm seeing things in the chat like self-perception. Yeah, this is a perfect example of a self-report measure. You, the researcher, asks your subject to tell you something about themselves. I see in the chat here introversion, extroversion. People always guess this about the adjective checklist. So you look at these adjectives and you go, a number of them might load on the sociability dimension. A very good guess, not accurate, but a good guess. Something to do with negative or positive, overly negative or overly positive outlooks. And that comes, DJ, from what observation? What are you thinking? I think I know what you're thinking, but I want you to tell me. No? Okay, Casey Joe made another point. She said, well, maybe when people fill this out, they're selective in what they choose to disclose because some of these items are what we could call socially undesirable. Okay, you may not feel comfortable saying I'm an arrogant, autocratic, conceited, opportunistic, hard-headed so and so. Okay, those are socially unacceptable personality traits. Okay, so this always happens when you give this to a large group of people. You show it to them, and they don't know what it is. So the first point to note in your notes regarding the adjective checklist, I go back to my PowerPoint here, is that it has zero face validity. Okay, you look at it, and you can't really you can't really tell what is being assessed. Okay, so zero face face validity. Try that again. Okay. The way you give it is really straightforward. The administration is standardized. The subject reads the blurb, and then you give them usually about 2 minutes to fill it out. The way that you score it, and you can score your own later, is also standardized. And the minute I tell you what it is and what it measures, you'll go, oh, okay, I see where they were coming from. It comes from a large, I'll put it in the chat here, a large personality battery called the California Personality Inventory, which I think is noted in your textbook, that has lots and lots of tests. The adjective checklist is the masculinity femininity scale from the CPI. Okay. And the way it was generated was by asking thousands and thousands of people to list adjectives that they think describe the stereotypic male and the stereotypic female. That doesn't mean that people, males and females, are a particular, show those particular traits, but it's what people think about male and female personalities. Okay, so now that I've told you that, I don't even have to give you the coding, the coding sheet, because you look at adjectives like aggressive, arrogant, cynical, dominant, and enterprising. Those are masculine items. And fickle, frivolous, helpful, jolly, and modest are feminine items. All right, there are 54 items in total, 27 of them. And when you give this to thousands of people, you can distill their responses so that what's on your test are those words that show up on almost everybody's list. Yeah, there are 27 masculine, stereotypic masculine items, and there are 27 stereotypic feminine items. Okay? And the way you score the ACL, and you can do this on your own, is you give, of course, 1 point for every masculine item that you endorse. Yeah. And you get a -1 for every feminine item that you endorse. Okay, so the theoretical range, let me see if I can pull up the whiteboard here. The theoretical range for the ACL where did the whiteboard go? Okay. Is between, okay, we're looking at this distribution here, between -27, which is what you get down here. You'd get a score -27 on the ACL if you endorsed all of the feminine items and none of the masculine items. And you'd get 27 if you endorsed all of the masculine items and none of the feminine items. Okay, and you can score that for yourself. So, as Casey Joe and a few other people noted in the chat, this is a perfect example of a self-report measure. I'm not watching you. I'm not having people rate you. I'm asking you, the subject, to tell me about yourself. Do you have any problems with that? Can we trust data collected using the adjective checklist or any self-report measure? Casey Joe?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. Okay.
Well, okay, hold on. Maybe I shouldn't be so polarizing. That wasn't a choice, polarizing. I would have picked that. I think that it can give us some information, but it doesn't give us all of the information.
Okay.
Someone's self-perception or self-awareness can vary greatly from somebody else. I know a lot of ignorant people. I also know some very self-aware people.
Perfect. Okay, so hang on. You have this habit of making multiple awesome points all in the same paragraph. So point number one that Casey just made is that people vary in their degree of self-knowledge. Okay, if you're psychoanalytically inclined, you would say it's a general principle that most of us are not aware of our inner traits. Okay, why? Because we're rigidly defending against all kinds of thoughts and ideas. All right, so that's point number one. Point number two that she made is that there are lots of reasons and situations in which we would be suspicious of people's self-report data. Do you always believe what people tell you about themselves? I mean, you come from the generation where you meet your mating partners online, where you advertise yourselves, okay, in profiles. When you read profiles on, those the dating websites or even the booty call websites, do you trust what everybody has to say about themselves? I'm guessing the answer is no. Uh, uh, right. Okay. So people are motivated in some situations to provide a very enhanced sketch of what kind of person you are. Now, there are ways to get around some of these issues in research. Okay. So, a research subject might feel uncomfortable while you're standing there, or when they give you the questionnaire that has their name on it, endorsing some of these socially undesirable traits. What can we do to minimize that? What can we say to our research subjects to facilitate them telling the truth? No?
That it's all going to be anonymous.
Thank you. Okay, that you can assure them that their responses will remain anonymous, and you can and you must assure them that their responses will be confidential. And that probably facilitates honest responding to some extent, but you never really know, okay, with self-report measures. We talked about this even in the context of the Rorschach, whether you're picking up legitimate data or not. Little interesting side note, research side note, regarding the adjective checklist. That comes from my own research, when you give it to women, when you give it to females at different points in the menstrual cycle, so when you give it to them, you have to change the instructions up a little bit, so that they read and tell us how you feel about yourself today, okay? But when you give them the ACL when estrogen levels are at their lowest in the cycle, that would be days 1 to 5, like when they're menstruating. By the way, did you read that piece today that the universities are thinking of adopting the policy of referring to females now, biological females now, as menstruators? Did anybody see that? Oh, okay, it's a thing now. You give it to them when they're menstruating, and then you give it to them again when estrogen levels are at their highest. At their highest in the cycle, that's during the ovulatory period, days 11 to 13. Do you think their responses are different? They're different. Okay, so if you scored your own and you sent me your scores and I plotted them on a distribution, where do you think the mean for your class would be?
Good comes. Good comes.
Okay, everybody sends me their score anonymously. I plot them. Where do you think the mean for this class would be? No guesses? Zero, zero, zero. Anybody think to the right or the left? To guess, I'd have to assume how many people identify. Yeah, okay. Well, I can tell you after giving this to very large groups of undergraduate students at York, that the mean is usually to the right of zero. It's positive, regardless of whether you're a male or a female. Okay. And that's because if you think of what you folks are doing for a living right now, if you think of what your life is like as an undergraduate, to be a successful, high functioning undergraduate, you have to be in possession of a lot of those traits that are stereotypically masculine. You have to be deliberate. You have to be inventive. You have to be intelligent and strong and sharp witted and sometimes shrewd. Okay, if we took the ACL down to the Playboy Mansion and gave it to the Playboy bunnies, the mean would undoubtedly be in a different place. And this comes from an old idea in psychology. In the old days in gender psychology, there was the belief that masculinity and femininity were two ends of the same continuum, meaning that the more masculine you are, the less feminine you are. Well, that idea was abandoned, thank goodness, and people now regard masculinity and femininity as independent traits. So you can be high on one, low on the other, high on both, low on both, and so on. Okay, we can poke holes in this measurement technique now. Okay, but there are fluctuations in females, at least, that map directly onto fluctuating levels of transient hormones during the menstrual cycle. There is a tradition in personality psychology that involves classifying people according to some basic dimension of personality. You can see my PowerPoint, yeah, with the distribution on it. Yes. You can see the PowerPoint slide with the, okay, good. Just wanted to make sure. And the adjective checklist is one of thousands of personality tests that classifies people on a distribution of certain traits. So if I collected enough adjective checklist questionnaires and plotted them, I'd get something that looks like this curve on the screen, a normal distribution. And researchers who conceptualize personality in this way are usually interested in describing how people who live, let's say, at this part of the distribution, okay, way up here, are different different in how they think, different in how they feel, different in how they behave, and so on, than someone who lives down here on the distribution. There's a huge genre of personality research like this. Okay, so the goal is to identify differences in the typical behavior or thought or emotions of people on different parts of the distribution. And psychologists, just to be fair, aren't the only ones who conceptualize personality in this way. I mean, I think it's probably fair to say that normally we think of personality in terms of traits. When I say, oh, I want you to meet my girlfriend so-and-so, she's really warm and funny and intelligent, that's what I'm doing, all right? Historically, efforts to describe personality in this way well, they've probably been around since the invention of language, but they've certainly been around since the time of the ancient Greeks. Okay, so when you go back to the time of the ancient Greeks and you look at the writings of people like Hippocrates, for example, you'll see that the ancient Greeks divided people into different types. Okay, in his case, he divided them into sanguine types. These are happy people. We like to be with those people, easy to get along with. Choleric, difficult people, temperamental people, phlegmatic individuals. These are the people who are reserved, okay, apathetic, all right. And then the melancholic individuals. These are the people who we call depressed or dysphoric nowadays. Not only did they divide people into different types, they even had theories about why they were those different types. Okay, so their theories were based on the idea that different personality types had their origins or roots in different, I'll write it in the chat here, bodily humors. Humor here having nothing to do with being funny or having nothing to do with comedy, but humor in a biological sense, referring to fluids. Okay, so the theory was that sanguine people were sanguine because they had an excessive amount of red blood cells. The melancholic person, the depressed person, had an overload of black bile produced by the liver. All right. And we giggle at these theories. Oh, we say, oh my gosh, it seems so silly. For any of you that have background in literature or the dramatic arts, you know that in their comedies and tragedies, the ancient Greeks, this is also true of the ancient Romans, tended to think of people as types. Okay, so you've got this large cast of stock characters in plays, the restless wife, the jealous husband, the cagey servant, and so on. And that tradition has very much continued in various forms, at least in the theater, to the present day. I'm guessing most of you don't know who Mike Nichols is, but there was a wonderful film director by the name of Mike Nichols. Watched a documentary on Netflix on him just a few weeks ago that was sensational. And he, in the interview, made the argument that in movies and in theater, there are really only three types of scenes. There are seduction scenes, there are negotiations, and there are conflicts. Okay, so not only do we have these stock types, but we have the idea that there are stock interactions as well. There's a whole history of correlational research in personality psychology that has tried, not unlike these ancient Greeks, okay, to relate certain types of personality features or certain types of behavior to various gross features of the organism. Gross here not meaning fat gross, like, oh, it grossed me out, but gross in a medical sense, which means observable. Okay? If you turn to the, if you move to the turn of the last century, you might be surprised to know that cutting-edge abnormal psychology and cutting-edge personality, oops, what did I do? Personality psychology was focused on what were known as somatotype theories. These were spearheaded by people like Kretschmer and Sheldon. They're given some press in your textbook. What did they do? They observed associations relationships between what a person's body type is like, okay, and what kind of personalities they have. Which is not really a crazy idea because we all suspect that going through the world as Cindy Crawford or Shaquille O'Neal is got to be different than going through the world as, Danny DeVito. They distinguished between three different body types, the endo Morph, okay, up here, the excessively corpulent body type. The long, lean mesomorph, you can put all your supermodels in here and basketball players, and the small, diminutive ectomorph, okay, smaller frame, shorter height, and so on. And they looked at those body types and they noticed that there were different personality features associated with those people. They gave them these names. Okay, so the endomorph is the person who is viscerotonic. They are outgoing, sociable, dependable, likable, often funny. Okay, those traits. The mesomorph type was associated with excessive confidence, sometimes aggression, extroversion, and so on. And the small little ectomorph, they noticed small ectomorphs tended to be inner oriented. They tended to be socially isolated. They tended to be more cerebral. Okay, and a great deal of attention was paid to these kinds of theories. Now, if we went out and collected data now, we tried to replicate, these somatotype relationships with much better personality tests than they had in the early 20th century, we'd probably find non-zero correlations. But if I came to class and said, hey, over reading week, folks, I collected some data showing that ectomorphs, people with this kind of body type, are more socially withdrawn than other people, you would not say, oh, that's impressive, Phillips. Run to present that at a conference or run to publish your results. You would criticize my data. On what grounds? What would you say?
Oh my god!
You would not be tempted to infer a real
Oh my
relationship
god, you're broken!
between the body, the appearance of the body, and certain personality features. Why not? Which came first, the body type or the personality type? Yeah, okay, everybody learned in statistics. You can't say it on the basis of correlational data. You can't say anything about cause and effect. Maybe A is causing B, but we don't know. It might be that B is causing A. Okay, what else would you say? Well, maybe these personalities features have nothing to do with people's bodies, but how we have stereotypes of people's body features. Okay, the idea here is that if you behave in an expected manner, you'll be reinforced. So if you watch family sitcoms, or look at the history of family sitcoms on television, every family sitcom has a chubby, funny, like this goes back to Leave It to Beaver, has a chubby, funny, remarkably likable child. Okay, so what we might be looking at here are the effects of stereotyping, or as Casey, Joe, and Eklas have pointed out, it might be totally confounded. Okay, it might be that little ectomorphic people are, more inclined to be withdrawn because when they were little, mothers of little ectomorphic children are more protective of them. Okay, so these are examples of what your textbook calls, the ancient Greeks and the somatotype theories are examples of what your textbook calls strict type approaches. They assume that everybody fits into one of these categories, that the people in each category are basically alike, and they assume that the behavior of the people in different categories are distinctly different. All right. And those assumptions clearly are difficult to meet, but it's still around in the modern day. If you checked your horoscope today, at some point, then you interfaced with a type approach. What happened in psychology, though, was that the type approach became replaced by the trait approach. And let's talk about what that means. Okay. A trait is a theoretical construct. And don't forget that when you're reading, okay? When you're reading the oodles of fun facts about personality traits in your textbook. It's easy to get fooled into thinking that they are concrete entities. There is nowhere on the planet now, even with our fancy diagnostic imaging and techniques, there's nowhere where you can put someone's head in a functional MRI and observe neuroticism or procrastination or shyness or any personality trait. Okay? It's a theoretical construct that describes a basic dimension of personality. And again, I think most of us would agree that normally we think of personality in terms of traits. She's honest, he's reliable, she's generous, and so on. It's the way most people conceptualize personality. And if you've taken a look at the material, if you've taken a look at the chapters that have been assigned for this section of the course, you'll see that there's not one trait theory, there are lots of trait theories. And those trait theories are not all the same. If you line them up, you see that they vary. They vary according to the number of traits that they think are basic. So you'll read about Raymond Cattell, who argued that there are 16 basic personality traits. We'll talk about Hans Eysenck next week, who argued that there are 3 major trait type superfactors. If you want to get money now, funding to do research in personality psychology, you'll probably say in your research proposal that you're going to use the Big 5 model, okay, the 5-factor model of personality. They're different, the models are different in the number of traits that they see as basic. They also differ in their ideas about those factors that govern the structure of personality. So when we talk about Eysenck next week, we're going to code him as the poster boy for the biological the biological model of personality functioning. When we talk about Allport later on tonight, we're going to code him as someone who emphasized the importance of social experiences. And they also differ, okay, a third dimension in which the trait theories vary is in the type of data that they generate. Now, it's fair to say that self-report data, that questionnaires, have pretty much formed the backbone of personality trait theories, okay? But depending on whose model you look at, you see a different emphasis on what must be addressed in questionnaires. All right, and when we talk about Allport today, he gave us a completely different idea about how to look at personality than everybody else did. So there's variability across the models, and you'll read about them in your textbook. But even though they vary considerably, they share at least 2 core assumptions, okay, that are at the bottom of the slide. At the bottom of the slide here, they share the assumption that traits, however they define them, are relatively stable over time. Okay. If I tell you that the patient is narcissistic, okay, or if I describe a colleague as generous, you expect that person to show generosity today, tomorrow, and 6 months from now. Now, everybody acknowledges that there are certain instances where people might be more or less generous or more or less self-confident, all right, and that's acknowledged by the trait approach. But the idea that they all share is the idea that over long stretches of time, there's a relatively stable level of, what did I say, generosity that can be identified. They also share the assumption that traits are relatively stable over situations. So if I label person X as aggressive, you expect that person to exhibit higher than average levels of aggression, not just in sporting activities or competitive activities, but in other places too. Okay, the assumption is that over many, many situations, there's a relatively stable, higher than average degree of aggressiveness that you can see. And the third assumption shared by all of the trait theories is that traits are measurable. Okay, I told you right at the outset of the lecture tonight that trait psychology focuses on measurement. It has this very strong psychometric emphasis. And the weird thing about trait psychology, I don't think this is noted in your book, but one of the weird things about trait psychology is that it developed atheoretically. Okay, usually in science, there's a kind of natural progression where you go from the theory to the model to the concept to the development of a measurement device. Here it went totally backwards, okay, or in the other direction. They started making the measurement devices first. All right, so historically now, just to recap what we've said, the idea of personality types has been around for a long time. Okay, they were paid significant attention going back to the ancient Greeks, going back not that long ago, just 100 years ago. We had this idea that the body is connected to personality in some way. All right, and I would argue to you that we still are proceeding very much in this vein. Okay, so we don't look at body types anymore. We look at the brain. I remember back in the day when CAMH, when it was at Spadina College, got its first PET scanner. Yeah, everybody was so excited. They had to move it 3 times because it was getting all messed up with the vibration from the streetcar tracks. All right, you've got this thing now that allows you to look at live brain function. So what is every clinician and researcher at CAMH doing or putting in research proposals for? To look at the brain. Brains of schizophrenic people, manic depressive people. Does the brain of an anxious person look differently than the brain of a normal, quote unquote, normal person or sociopathic person? Okay, we are still looking for relationships between not body now, but brain and personality features, because we're guided by the idea, let me go back to this slide, that for something to be real, let me draw your attention to the fMRI data here, for something to be real, it must exist in the corporal. Okay, so we can laugh at the ancient Greeks and the early 20th century personality psychologists, but there's an excellent chance that your grandchildren will be laughing at our theories. These ideas have, or this idea that traits exist, that they can, that you can measure them, and that they're stable over time and situations, was wholeheartedly embraced in psychology over the last 80 to 85 years, not just in personality psychology, but by psychologists in working in lots of other fields, working in education, working in industrial psychology, working in clinical psychology. And then there's this whole industry that we could call the psychological testing or measurement industry. And I want to say a few things about this because I think it's an important point, and it's really not addressed in your textbook. Let me just get that. Let me provide some kind of critical commentary, and then you tell me what you think. So I'll pick some examples from these different areas. Let's go back to our aptitude testing. All college admissions tests, all graduate program admissions tests, these aptitude tests, are considered to measure stable individual differences. All right, so you go to your academic advisor and you say, I want to go to Harvard Medical School. Yeah. Your advisor will guide you as to how to best prepare for that, which course to take in anticipation of the MCAT, how to write the personal statement letter, and so on and so on. All right, so when you write the MCAT on a given day, you write it with thousands of other people. And then you get your score, and you get your score. Your score is a reflection of your percentile ranking. This is true on the LSAT. This is true on all of the standardized measures. And then Harvard looks at all of the applications and they say, well, we just want people who are in the 98th percentile or better. Why? Because they're Harvard. They can do that. Yes. Very, very competitive. So they make the assumption that the person, let's go back to this distribution and pretend it's a set of MCAT scores here. Harvard says, we just want these people way up here. And when they say that, they make the assumption that those are the most talented people from the standpoint of IQ points, yeah, and that they're going to make the best doctors. Is that an accurate assumption?
No.
Thank you. Because?
Because that's not the only measure of individual ability.
Well, okay, but we would all agree that we want our doctors to live here, okay, rather than down here. If you had to pick a doctor from any part of the distribution, you'd want one from around here. But what's the problem in assuming that those people who wrote on that day, okay, because you get ranked to everybody else who wrote that day, are the finest of the bunch, the best in show group? You know, and I know that your performance, forget the MCAT names. You make the, you know, and I know that your performance on any evaluative measure, yeah, it's going to reflect your knowledge, to some degree, but it's also going to reflect a whole bunch of other things. Like what? Think about the test that you wrote. For me, thank you, Yasmin. Think about the test you wrote in this course a couple of weeks ago. If you wrote that test 2 days later, would you get exactly the same score? Probably not. Okay. There were probably a group of people on that Tuesday night who were feeling sick. Okay. That played into their score. Privilege, bias, opportunity, energy levels, stress levels. Here she goes again, Casey Jo. Always a multi-pronged answer. Yeah, all of these can play into your score on any given test. Did you have a wicked fight with your partner the night before? Did something really horrible happen to you the day of or the night before? Okay, but the assumption in aptitude testing, what do you mean triggered here, Casey Jo? Did I trigger you?
No, I'm making a poor joke saying memorization.
Oh, okay.
Never mind. Just
They make
I'll stop
the
commenting.
assumption.
I'm done.
Okay. They make the assumption that they're picking up a stable entity. Okay? And to some extent, undoubtedly they are, but it doesn't tell us the whole picture. The idea that cognitive traits are stable has been wholeheartedly embraced in aptitude testing. The idea that traits are stable has been wholeheartedly embraced in pedagogy, in education. Just talk to someone who's been diagnosed with a learning disability. My psychologist friends tell me that they are diagnosing learning disabilities as young as 2 and 3 now, if you can imagine that. Okay. When you talk to people who've been diagnosed with learning disabilities, it's not at all uncommon to hear them say, nobody asked me along the journey whether the disability was still there or whether it was of the same magnitude or not. Okay, so a kid tests in a certain way at a certain time at a certain age, and then that label stays with them forever. Okay. Trying to follow the chat here. Okay, because there's a belief that that entity that's called a learning disability is a pervasive, stable trait. Clinical psychologists are guilty of this all the time, although we don't like to admit it much. Trait measures are used all the time in making diagnoses. Okay, so someone, oh, I wish you people in the chat would give voice to this. What was I going to say? Someone scores high on a particular measure of depression. They get hospitalized, they get medicated, a whole series of events ensues in their lives. They're treated in a certain way for a long stretch of time. Now, how many people here? That's a great question, Michelle. Maybe ask me later because it's relevant to what we're going to talk about. How many people see personality in this way as something that's pretty much stable? I'm an introvert now. I've always been an introvert. I can't imagine being an extrovert. I'm basically who I am, and I've always been like that. How many people here, honestly, put up your hand, see personality in this way? Okay, one person. All right. So for those of you who don't, what's the alternative? If you don't see personality as a stable entity, how do you see it? So factors can change. People can change, people can grow. Okay. The major, thank you, LSR. The major theoretical alternative to this idea is that personality traits don't exist, that behavior is not controlled by these hypothetical theoretical traits, but that behavior is controlled by the degree of regularity that we see in external stimuli. Another way of saying that is that it's the situation that's more important than these traits. And when you do observe consistency in people, in their behavior, in their thoughts, in their feelings, and so on, what you're really looking at is consistency in situations. Okay, it's the environment that shapes the illusion of these traits. And I saw that idea in some of your responses in the chat. In the late 1960s, Walter Mischel, whose name in the chat. May he rest in peace. He just died not too long ago. Wrote a book that eviscerated the trait approach. Okay, he showed very clearly that people behave one way in one situation and another way in a different situation. Personality is sensitive to the situation. Okay, so you can observe someone being super anxious and fearful in the dental chair, but then follow that person and you can find that they are also a person that goes skydiving or takes, risky chances in the casino or the sexual arena. It was a very big deal when he published that book, and it turned the field very much upside down. And interestingly, his book is still in press, a 1968 book that is still in press. And that book spawned what came to be known as the trait situation battle. Now, he was a clinical psychologist, and he made the following argument. He said, when you get someone to take, let's say, an MMPI, and I've showed the class the MMPI, and your patient or your research subject scores really high on the introversion scale, the trait theorist assumes that score is a indication of how introverted that person really is. Okay? That their responses on a personality test are seen as signs of the subject's true personality. Mischel said, forget that. He said, instead of assessing personality on the basis of signs, they should be based on the basis of samples. Samples of what? Samples of behavior. So if I want to know if you're introverted or not, yeah, I could give you an MMPI and observe your score on the introversion scale, or I could bring you into the laboratory and ask you to conduct a mock telephone interview. And he argued that the mock telephone interview would be a better assessment procedure than looking at someone's score. So he called into the question the validity of a whole bunch of psychological tests. And much of his attack against the trait perspective was predicated on the argument that knowing where someone is on a trait distribution never allows us to predict their behavior with a high degree of accuracy. Okay, so if the situation is more important than the person, and personality assessments are based on trait measurement, then you can't really say anything meaningful about future behavior. As a clinical psychologist, he was very sensitive and aware of the fact that personality inventories are used all the time in clinical settings in ways that influence the lives of people. And he said there's no basis for this. It was Michelle who, I think, Michelle, it was called Personality and Assessment. I'll look that up for you on the break, but I'm pretty sure it was called Personality and Assessment. It was Michelle who coined the phrase the personality coefficient to refer to those really, really small correlations that are around positive 0.2 to positive 0.3 that you find when you look at the relationship between people's scores on personality tests and their behavior in certain situations. There was a classic set of studies undertaken by a long time ago. Maybe you had to watch these in your intro course, conducted by Hartshorn and May on conscience and cheating behavior. They had a bunch of kids. They'd bring kids into the lab rather, and they'd say, okay, little Johnny, we're going to give you a math test now. And the teacher would sit there and she would tell the child, I have the answers to the test on my lap here. Okay, please proceed with the test. And then the phone would ring, okay, and the teacher would answer the phone and say, okay, I'll be right there. And she'd go to the kid and say, I have to leave the room for a while. You just proceed with the test. And then she put the answers to the test upside down on the desk beside the kid. All of the kids who said in interviews and questionnaires when they were asked about cheating, all of the kids who said cheating's bad, shouldn't cheat here, shouldn't cheat there, and so on, when given a safe opportunity to cheat, not all of them, many of them, when given a safe opportunity to cheat, cheated. How did they know that? The kids were behind a one-way mirror. Okay, so after the phone rang, the researcher comes out to the other side of the mirror and records whether the kid cheats or not. All right, so knowing someone's score on any trait measure does not afford you a great deal of predictive power. That's a serious, serious indictment of the trait approach. Let me say one more thing about another criticism before we take a break here. This criticism is in your book, but it's so messed up and it's so convoluted. I'm going to try and say it simply here. It actually comes from our friend B.F. Skinner, the great American behaviorist, who pointed out another liability of the trait approach. He argued that the trait approach is liable to or prone to a logical error. What kind of logical error? The error of confusing description with explanation. So you say someone is introverted, or you say someone is depressed, or you say someone is neurotic, even if you've taken the utmost care to observe their behavior and to measure those traits properly, it does not have any explanatory value. Okay, and this kind of confusion is repeatedly made by trait theorists. And you see it in clinical settings all the time. All right, so someone some teacher calls parents and says, I think your kid needs to to be assessed. The parents get nervous. They take the kid to a educational psychologist, test the heck out of the kid, and then they call the parents in for feedback, for a feedback session. And the psychologist looks at them and says, well, on the basis of the test data, it's my expert opinion that your kid is getting into trouble at school all the time and their marks are dropping because your kid has conduct disorder. And you see a wave of relief on the faces of the parents. It's like, oh, well, now that explains everything. But when you say to someone, or when you label someone as having conduct disorder or neuroticism or anxiety or shyness, does it have any explanatory value? What do you think? Does it explain anything? No. Okay. You make a trait attribution. Little Johnny is aggressive. And then you use that to explain it by putting a diagnostic label. No, not really. That's right. Putting a diagnostic label on it. When you tell someone in a feedback session that their test data indicates that they're depressed, all you're saying is that their symptoms, as they've declared on whatever measurement technique, fits the cluster of symptoms that define this disorder called depression. You're not saying anything about where it comes from. It's not like medicine. It's not like giving a diagnosis of tuberculosis, for example. When you tell someone they have tuberculosis, you're making a very specific statement about what it is, okay, where it comes from. A particular type of bacteria have invaded the lining of the lungs. And when you make a diagnosis in medicine, it's usually prescriptive. Okay? Oh, you've got diagnosis, you give the patient drug X, you give them isoniazid or whatever. You can't confuse description with explanation. And we have to be mindful of that, especially when we're talking about traits. Okay. I'll take some questions if you have any. Okay, so why don't we take 10 or 12 minutes, and then when we come back, we'll say a few words about Gordon Allport. Good? Okay. Okay, and we are back. Okay, as I said in the first half of the lecture, this perspective, this approach, was wholly embraced by the psychological community. But the first recognized work on traits really didn't appear until the 1920s, 100 years ago, when Gordon Allport and his brother Floyd, another name that should ring a bell from intro, published a book called Personality Traits. And he's usually credited for conducting the groundbreaking work in this area. And we, okay, tonight or every Tuesday night, also owe him credit because he was the first to teach, or he taught the very first course in personality psychology. I think at Dartmouth College, kind of known as the patron saint of personality psychology. Those of you who are interested in the topic of individual differences also have to quietly acknowledge Allport as the father of that movement. Okay, he was someone who championed, forcefully championed the study of individual differences. And even though you'll read about other theorists in the chapter that was assigned for tonight, significant contributions made by other theorists. I want to spend the rest of the time that we have tonight talking about him because his theory and his approach and his ideas anticipated a lot of the themes that would concern personality psychology for decades and continue to concern us. So, good place to start would be to look at his definition, which I've put on the screen here. He defined personality as the dynamic organization within the individual of those psychophysical systems that determine characteristic behavior and thought. So it's short, but I want to point out a number of things in the definition here. I would circle dynamic organization because for Allport, personality is something that's always changing and always growing, and that the growth is organized. It's not just a random growth, but it is in some sense organized in terms of its structure. I would also highlight the word psychophysical in this definition, because for him, personality is composed of both mind and body functioning together. Personality is neither all mental nor is it all physical, okay, but working together. I would underline the word determine in this definition, okay, because for Allport, personality has a causal power. It can direct behavior. It can direct thought. That's how he conceptualized it. And I would also put a circle around characteristic behavior and thought, because the idea here, the important contribution here, is his idea that, or acknowledgement rather, that each person is unique. Okay, what we do, how we think, how we feel is characteristic to us as individual people. A little bit of personal data about him, kind of interesting. He did his dissertation at Harvard on personality traits, which was very radical at the time. He knew a great deal about psychoanalysis because that was the psychology of his time. But he also knew a great deal about operant conditioning. Why was that? Because also at Harvard, at the same time that he was there, He was colleagues with B.F. Skinner. And when he, as an older scholar, reflected back on his early days, I used to show a film in this, used to assign a film in this lecture, but it has degraded, unfortunately, where you can listen to him reflect on his earlier time in the field. He described it as working in an era that was very reductionistic. Now, it's easy to think of behaviorism as reductionistic. Okay, that's how we teach behaviorism now. Behaviorism breaks down people into these discrete stimulus response associations. But he also, imagine this, he also thought of psychoanalysis as being reductionistic. Why? Because psychoanalysis, according to him, fragments people. It fragments people into these, conflicting parts. And he thought both of those approaches were very, very restricted. There's a great story about him going to visit Freud in Vienna. Okay, Freud was accustomed to receiving scholars from all over the world. Allport made an appointment to see him, and he describes it. Let me read it for you. I love this story, and it's funny for sure, but it's also very telling. Okay, so this is Allport on his meeting with Freud. Quote, I was not prepared for silence and had to think fast to find a suitable conversational gambit. Right? So you go and see Freud. What are you going to talk about? I told him of an episode on the tram car on my way to his office. A small boy about 4 years of age had displayed a conspicuous dirt phobia. He kept saying to his mother, I don't want to sit there. Don't let that dirty man sit beside me. To the little boy, everything was schmutz, dirt, okay? His mother was a well-starched housefrau, so dominant and purposive looking that I thought the cause and effect apparent. Okay, so you go into Freud's office, you sit down, Freud's doing Freud. He's not talking. Yeah. So Allport scrambles to find something to talk about. What does he do? He shares a clinical observation that he made on the streetcar, okay, with this child and his mom. When I finished my story, Freud Freud fixed his kindly therapeutic eyes upon me and said, and was that little boy you? Flabbergasted and feeling a bit guilty, I contrived to change the subject. Freud's misunderstanding of my motivation was amusing, and the experience taught me that depth psychology may sometimes plunge too deep. Okay? And that set the stage in a lot of ways for a lot of his theoretical developments. Now, your text, the assigned readings for tonight, and the way that we've been talking about traits in the lecture tonight have been along the lines of what Allport called a nomothetic approach. Okay? So researchers go out, they look at common traits, that's what he called them, those aspects of personality that most people in a given group or culture would be expected to possess to some extent, and then they compare them. Yeah, made that point early on tonight. People who research these common traits compare their subjects with one another. And he said this is important. Okay, it's an important way to understand personality. It's an indispensable way to understand personality. Okay, so let's go back to our distribution here. You pick a common trait to study, you look at it in people and how it distributes itself, and then you can compare how this person up here or groups of people who live here are different than groups of people who live in a different part of the distribution. He said that's fine. That's what he called the nomothetic approach. But he also championed another way of researching personality traits. He said that rather than forcing everybody, all of your research subjects, into categories that you, the researcher, select beforehand, which is exactly what we do when we give people or patients or research participants a psychological test, that there's also value in what he called the idiographic approach. The idiographic approach, and this was defined in the first couple of chapters, but it becomes real here when we talk about Allport. It's all about identifying that unique combination of traits that best accounts for a single individual. Okay, what does that mean practically in terms of doing research? It means that the subject, the participant, whatever you want to call them, not you, the researcher, determines what traits to examine. Okay, none of you or none of us get training in that as undergraduates. Okay, you get a different kind of training. But Allport said we should value what people say about themselves, and we should take that information at face value. So if we stop right now, okay, we can say that this is completely antithetical to the Freudian approach, completely different than the psychoanalytic tradition. Freud listened to people, yeah, but he was interested only in their words to the extent that those words informed him about something that he couldn't see directly, observe directly. Freud did not take verbalizations at face value. Okay, he did anything but that. Now, that has implications for collecting data. All right, and he illustrated the use of the idiographic approach in what he called, I'll give you an example of this, the personal documents technique. So he wrote a book. You can go to the library and take a look at a book called Letters from Jenny. Okay, written by Allport. And in that book, you'll find his analysis of 300 letters written by this woman. I think her pseudonym was Jenny Masterson, something like that, over the course of her life. And then he analyzed those letters for central traits in that person. Is it time consuming? For sure. But we can ask, do you get a much more enlightened portrait, maybe meaningful portrait or account of a person by looking at 300 letters that she wrote rather than looking at her scores on some pre-selected personality dimensions? And that highlights some really important methodological distinctions and implications. I'm going to leave your textbook here, okay, and make some distinctions that probably aren't familiar to you, but will highlight what his methodological contributions were. When you look at the history of science, any science, not just psychology, when you look at biology and chemistry and so on, what you see is that natural history, I'm seeing an error on the slide, it should be natural history and experimental science on the other side. Natural history always comes before experimental science. Before you can conduct an awesome experiment, Okay. You have to have a sense of the phenomenon. That's true in psychology. That's true in biology. Before the great experiments in biology, you had hundreds and hundreds of people out there in the naturalistic world watching, describing, labeling, categorizing, and so on. Okay. You go to your supervisor for an undergraduate thesis and you say, I want to study bullying in grade school kids. Your supervisor will say, well, give me your working operational definition of bullying. And you better have given that question some thought. And the only way you can do that is by looking at it, getting a sense of it. Okay? Is bullying when child A physically aggresses against child B? Can it be verbal? Can it come in the form of shunning? Okay, you have to spend some time on what I like to call the plane of observation, where you watch. You watch closely. You make notes. You might notice certain patterns. Oh, every time this happens, that happens. Okay, so natural history as as a phase in the process always involves a descriptive activity. Now, when you look at human subjects in an idiographic sense, it's always in the context of an engaged relationship with that person. The person speaks. You listen carefully to what the person says. The person or the subject brings episodes to bear that they choose, not you, the experimenter, but that they choose as meaningful from their lives, which you hope will be informative to you regarding the phenomenon of interest. Are you with me? Am I describing myself clearly here? Okay. When you do that, which is exactly what you do in a clinical interview, by the way, okay, when you do that with another human being, it gives you very rich, or what philosophers like to call thick description. That's what a case study is. That's what a clinical interview yields. So at the beginning of the class tonight, I gave you this thing called the adjective checklist. And that's one way for me to get information from Psychology 2130 students about how you identify with masculine or feminine stereotypes. And most of you who go on in psychology will collect your data in this way. Yeah, you'll cook up a proposal, you get it signed by ethics, then you might contact me and say, Phillips, can I come into one of your big second year lectures and distribute my questionnaire to your students? And I'll say, yeah, sure. And you bring your questionnaire in, and at the end of the class, you've got a stack of questionnaires, and you're so excited, okay, because there are few things sexier than fresh data, and then off you'll go to analyze your data. Okay. The Department of Psychology at York University has given you, I don't know if you can see my cursor here moving, but has put you through all kinds of torture and hoops focused not on descriptive techniques, but rather on the right-hand side of the screen on how to conduct experiments, how to interpret experiments, how to evaluate experiments, how to define experiments. That's what you get training in. You don't get training in this process over here. Okay? So most of you will collect data in that way. And that's one way That's just one way I can get data from you on how you identify with masculine and feminine stereotypes. But it's not the only way I could do that. What else could I do if I really, really wanted to know how Psychology 2130 kids identify with stereotypes? Because the ACL is not the only game in town. What else could I do? Somebody? I could have a conversation with you. Okay. I could sit down with you and find out what attributes of masculinity, femininity are meaningful to you. Instead of forcing my schema, my adjective checklist schema down your throat, I could let you tell me how you construe the phenomenon. And if I did that, I wouldn't at all be surprised to find people in the class who say, "I think this adjective is stupid," or "I think another adjective should be in there." This always involves an engaged relationship with the research subject. Everybody here has heard of the Kinsey report, yeah, the most famous sex survey of all time, completed after World War II. When you go to the library, and you can, okay, we have it in our library at Scott. There's these two honking volumes, one for males, one for females, that came from detailed face-to-face interviews with thousands of people on the most intimate details of their sexual lives. We actually have two faculty members at York, I won't tell you who they are, who were participants in that research. So you open that up, needs to be updated undoubtedly, but you open that up and you find the natural history of human sexuality, let's say. Okay, that's the idiographic approach. When you employ a nomothetic approach, which is what we do in experimental science, your subjects are important to you, but only in the context of a sample space. Okay, you look at lots of subjects and you get a distribution. You collect the data from a large intro class. You're grateful to your subjects, but you only know where that your subjects are important to you. Let's go back to this. Only to the extent that they contribute to this. You will know nothing else about those people, and you won't care about anything else about those people other than where they exist on the distribution of whatever dependent measure that you're assessing. So the upside to the idiographic approach is that you get very, very rich data on a few people. You know, the downside, of course, is the bias that can result from you looking at, excessive grounding in an individual's life. Sometimes it's inappropriate to use an idiographic approach. So I spoke to a student the other day. She's interested in looking at age-related changes in preferences for certain odors in kids. Okay, she's interested in how scented products for children sell in the marketplace, and wants to ask the question: are there distinct preferences as kids get older, from 5 to, I don't know, 8 or 9? Well, if you're doing that kind of research, then you want lots of 5-year-olds, you want lots of 6-year-olds, you want lots of 7-year-olds, and so on, to remove the effect of idiosyncratic experiences with odors. You want to look at groups. You want to employ a nomothetic approach. Historically, let's go further down on the slide here. Historically, when you look at our own discipline, when you look at psychology and how the subject was viewed, you see exactly the same thing. When psychology was born, the primary methodology, does anybody remember what Wundt was doing back in the day when psychology was born? What was he asking his subjects to do? Was he giving them questionnaires? No, he was asking him to introspect, okay, to reflect on their own conscious activities. It involved an interpersonal interaction between himself and the subjects. They collaborated in the exercise. Most research in contemporary psychology is not conducted in this manner. So you see this historical transition from the subject as a self-observer, looking at the left-hand side of the screen here, okay, that's participating with the experimenter, to the subject as observed by you, the detached experimenter. Here's the language that I like to use when I think about these concepts. When you use the idiographic approach, you view the subject as a particularized other in the context of their own life experience. When you use a nomothetic approach, you deal with your subject as a generalized other, an individual in a distribution, an individual in a sample space. He was one of the first, this will be relevant to us next week, but maybe worth saying here. He conducted a very famous study in the 30s where he listed all of the, and imagine this, doing this by hand, all of the descriptive trait words in Webster's dictionary. He just turned to everyday language to understand traits. And he found something like 18,000 trait names. That's about 4.5% of the, or it was about 4.5% of the dictionary. Very, very influential psycholexical study in the history of trait psychology. Okay, tried to classify those trait terms using a variety of techniques. So for Allport, just to recap, he said that traits are real, that they motivate thought, behavior, and emotion, that they determine behavior, they can be demonstrated empirically, yeah, and that it's important, yes, to look at groups, but it's also important to look at individuals in depth. Okay, draw a line in your notes. I'm going to say a couple of words. We're going to make a couple of comments on his ideas about development. You won't be surprised after everything that we've said tonight that Allport argued that the notion of self should be a major topic of study in personality psychology. He didn't call it the self. He called it, I'll write it in the chat here, the proprium. Okay, but you can think of the proprium as the self. He defined it as all aspects of the personality that make for unity, which is a nice sentence, but hard to unpack. But what is clear here is his emphasis on a whole person. He believed in studying whole people, and that was continued later in the humanistic tradition. In his discussion of development, he offered a really interesting new idea, again, mainly as a reaction against Freud's preoccupation with the past. All right, remember that the cornerstone of Freudian thinking on personality development is that it's pretty much completely determined by early childhood experiences, that the personality is laid down by the time we're 5 to 6 years of age. Allport suggested an alternative. He said, whatever the original cause for the development of any given personality trait, at some point, it begins to operate independently of its origin. And he gave us a really nice phrase for this. He called this functional autonomy. Okay? So Freud said that the roots of personality are planted early, and this is the important part, that the motives that underlie adult behavior, why do you do what you do as a grown-up, are the same as the motives that underlie those behaviors when you were a child. Let me give you an example. How many people here, I can't tell, I haven't heard from anybody in a while, how many people here love to read, would call yourself an avid reader? You really like to read. Put up your hand. I'm going to join you. Thank you, Mia. There's one avid reader in the group. Okay. Going up. All right. How many of those people had, okay, so we looked at the numbers there. How many of those people had parents who valued reading? Put up your hand. Okay, close to the same. Oh, yes, almost the same number. How many of those people had parents who, you don't have to answer this, insisted on you demonstrating reading ability, or maybe rewarded you for reading as a child? Okay. If we asked Freud, why do you love to read now as a young adult? Freud would say, well, you're an avid reader now for the same reasons that you read as a child. It afforded you acceptance, praise, maybe tangible rewards. Okay? We do it for the same reasons now as we did when we were kids. Allport said that behaviors that might have been at one time a means to an end, oh, if I read, mom and dad will love me, okay, they become functionally autonomous. So that if I sat down and had a conversation with you and said, well, what is it that you love about reading? You would say, well, I like reading for its own sake. I like where I go in my house when I read, or I like the smell of the pages, or I like the ability to, shut off everything else and escape uh, um, to a piece of literature and so on. Not that you're not doing it to please your mommy anymore. Okay, huge departure from Freud. I was thinking about this a couple of weeks ago. I went and I thought about this lecture, and then I'll shut up, I promise. Went to a bar mitzvah a couple of weeks ago, and I sat beside the most charming, socially cultivated, well-mannered 12-year-old boy that you could possibly imagine. And you say, charming 12-year-old boy, no such creature. All right, they just don't exist. But this kid could carry on a discourse at a super high level. Okay. He was into it. Okay. He was engaging all these, a table of 10 or 9 other adults. His manners were like off the charts awesome. Like I can't even, I looked at him and I thought, how do you make something like this? All right. So cultivated, and well-mannered. And, as someone who has raised kids and who lives, on a street where there is a grade school, so I hear them, all the time. As someone who pays attention, he was just remarkably atypical. Okay. To the point that, like, when I got up to use the powder room, he actually stood up. I mean, you just don't see these behaviors nowadays. And I thought, well, where, like, it was fascinating. I was just so, um, I couldn't take my eyes off him. And I thought, well, where does that come from? It is remarkably atypical. And his parents were at my table. Okay, big round table of 10. I looked at his mom, like really nice person, but clearly did not come from her. Looked at his dad, again, really nice guy, but maybe the worst table manners I've ever seen before. Wherever this kid got it, wasn't from his parents, but wherever he did get it from, you could see that he was engaging in this kind of social interaction for the sheer pleasure of it. Okay, and I thought, okay, this is a perfect example of what Allport was talking about. Okay, it came from somewhere that wasn't immediately apparent, but he was into it for its own sake. Okay, folks, I'll stop there. Any questions or commentary or anything like that? I think I exhausted you a bit tonight. Alrighty. I have a question, but it's not related to the lecture. Do you want to ask your question now, Ruth? I'll take the recording off, but
It was a quick question about the exam. I'm planning on talking to the TA. I'm pretty happy with how I did in the exam, but I was just wondering, um, if I would be able to see how I did on specific sections like the lectures versus the textbook. Would that, if I talked to the TA, would she be able to provide me with that information?
uh yeah, well the TAs, hang on a second here. The TAs have a master copy, okay, with the breakdown of the items. So it would have to be in person, okay, but she could go on to eClass and go through your items specifically. You have every right to do that. Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, not a problem. And glad you're happy with your mark. Um, okay, folks, then I'll say good night. And I'll see you next week for the traits part two session. We'll look at some selected contributions from Hans Eysenck. I'm going to give you some really depressing news about him, and we'll go through um, some data from the research on the Big Five. Okay, have a good week. Ciao, ciao. See ya.
Manaphy or the Greninja. They destroyed my whole board. We went to game